There are evenings that don't start with foreboding. No thunder over the rooftops, no prophetic shadow falling across the dinner table. There are evenings like ours, where the world feels mundane and safe, and the only warning comes as a flicker, under the skin, a feeling you can almost ignore. I stood by the window with a wooden spoon in hand, stirring tomato sauce while laughter drifted from the living room, the voices of my husband and our friends weaving in and out of the kitchen doorway. My best friend's husband. He was there too, of course, telling stories in that half-mocking tone of his, making the others laugh in a way that made me want to roll my eyes and listen closer at the same time. We had been doing these dinners for years, the four of us, ever since our kids left for university, and the silences in our homes started echoing. Our routine had all the safety of tradition. He brings a bottle of Rioja, I make pasta, my husband opens up about work, my friend teases everyone about their eating habits. If I am honest, I'd always been a little envious of the easy banter in their marriage, her constant affection, his irreverent humor, but I told myself, as women my age often do, that these things are just for show. Tonight was no different, except for a moment. I remember drying my hands and catching a glimpse of a phone left face up on the kitchen counter. A message, half hidden by the glare of the lamp. A red heart, a sly smile. I hesitated. Curiosity is a hungry animal, and then saw my own name above the text. Just a joke, I told myself. But the air around me shifted, subtly, as if the walls had leaned in. I looked up to see him standing there, not quite smiling, eyes unreadable. "Did you need help with the salad?" His voice was low, almost bored, but there was something just beneath the words, a current I hadn't noticed before. I shrugged, turning away, determined to steady myself. "If you want to be useful, you can set the table," I said, keeping my tone light. His arm brushed against mine as he reached for the plates, a touch so slight it could have been accidental. But it wasn't. I watched him out of the corner of my eye as he laid the silverware in neat lines, his movements almost meticulous. He glanced at me, and for a second we were alone, despite the others' laughter. There was something intimate about being seen like that, not as someone's wife, not as a friend's companion, but as myself, flesh and breath, with all my private hunger. After dinner, when the plates were cleared and the wine was running low, my husband and my friend started arguing over a football match they'd watched years ago, both a little too loud and nostalgic. I retreated to the kitchen, feigning the need to wipe down the counters, but really just needing space to breathe. He followed a few minutes later, under some flimsy pretext about needing more napkins. Our eyes met. His gaze was direct, almost challenging, and for a moment I felt exposed, like the thin strap of silk beneath my sweater was visible to him alone. "Everything okay?" he asked, voice pitched lower now, almost gentle. "Fine," I replied, too quickly. There was a pause, the kind that hums in your bones. I heard my friend's laughter from the other room, and for the first time it sounded far away, muffled, like music from an old record in another apartment. He moved closer to where I stood by the sink, but said nothing more. The scent of his aftershave, something dark with a trace of wood smoke, lingered in the small space between us. My skin prickled with memory and anticipation, a language older than reason. That night, after everyone had left, I lay beside my husband in the silent, shared dark. He reached for me, an unconscious gesture of comfort. I let him, but my mind drifted. The world was a map of invisible lines, and I had just crossed one, just by wanting, by letting myself wonder, by remembering a message not meant for anyone else's eyes. Sleep was slow to come, and when it did, it carried with it the taste of wine, the warmth of candlelight, and the undeniable thrill of having been noticed in a way that was both dangerous and intoxicating. I told myself nothing had happened, that it was all in my head. But I knew, with the certainty of someone who has lived long enough to recognize the storm before it breaks, that everything ordinary had shifted just slightly off its axis. Tomorrow would be the same, or so I wanted to believe. But the truth, quiet, patient, and merciless, had already begun its slow work beneath my skin. The next days passed in that liminal haze that often follows a disruption so subtle no one else can see it. I moved through my routines, grocery shopping, answering work, emails, folding laundry, clinging to their familiar weight as if they could anchor me. But every surface in the house seemed charged, my nerves tuned to a frequency only I could hear. I caught myself replaying glances and gestures in my mind, dissecting the shape of his smile, the roughness of his voice when he said my name. I changed the sheets and lingered at the window, watching the city below, feeling that restless itch just beneath my skin. It was a Thursday afternoon when it happened. I'd left the house in a hurry, list in hand, the old canvas bag slung over my shoulder. The market was busy, crowded with the low hum of conversation and the clatter of baskets against tile. My friend had called earlier. She needed things for dinner. Could I grab them? I almost said no, but there was a thrill in being useful, in being needed by someone outside my own four walls. I think now that I wanted a reason to be in the world, visible and moving, not just fading into the background. I turned into the parking lot, rain starting to splatter against the windshield, and there he was, wrestling with an umbrella and two overstuffed grocery bags. For a split second, I considered driving past, pretending not to see, but he spotted me and waved, a crooked smile playing on his lips. The sky cracked open, rain pounding harder. He jogged over, ducking into the passenger seat before I could protest, drops of water on his forehead and collar. "Always raining when you least expect it," he said, brushing a wet strand of hair from his eyes. His tone was casual, but something in the set of his jaw told me he was just as aware of the line we'd already crossed. We sat in the car, watching the downpour turn the world outside into a blur of silver and gray. It felt strangely private, the two of us sealed away from everyone, the storm giving us permission to be still. I could smell the scent of his rain-damp jacket, a hint of soap and something darker underneath. He handed me a receipt, "For your friend," and our fingers touched, lingering a moment longer than necessary. Neither of us spoke for a while. The silence was thick, almost comforting. The windshield fogged up, making the world even smaller. I tried to focus on my breathing, on the rhythm of rain on glass, but my heart was beating too fast, and the hush between us felt alive. He shifted in his seat, his eyes fixed on the parking lot ahead, then glanced at me. Steady, unblinking. "You seemed different the other night," he said quietly, words nearly lost under the drum of the rain. I didn't know how to answer. I wanted to laugh it off, dismiss it as nerves or wine, but I couldn't lie to either of us. My hands twisted in my lap, betraying the heat climbing up my neck. I felt different, I admitted. I can't explain it. The honesty startled me as if the rain had washed away all my practiced caution. I felt exposed but also unburdened. He turned, angling his body toward me, and for a moment there was no sound but the storm. Then suddenly he reached for me. It wasn't theatrical, nothing like a scene from a film. It was clumsy and real, the way his hand hesitated at first, then cupped the side of my jaw, thumb brushing just under my ear. I let my eyes close, breath caught, and then his mouth was on mine. The kiss was quick, almost accidental. Our teeth clicked, his stubble scratched my cheek. I tasted the rain on his lips, felt the urgent tremor of his fingers in my hair. It was everything forbidden. Not sweet, not romantic, but alive, hungry, reckless. When we pulled apart, it was because someone banged a car door nearby, jarring us back to ourselves. He laughed, a rough, nervous sound. I caught my reflection in the window, wide-eyed, flushed, alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. He said, "We should go." I nodded, not trusting my voice. We both understood that the shape of things had changed forever, that this was not a mistake we could explain away later. Driving home, I kept replaying the moment. My lips still tingled, my skin warm beneath my coat. That night, folding napkins and setting the table for another dinner, I caught myself humming. I wore a silk camisole under my sweater, hidden from everyone, but for me it was a secret talisman, a way to remember what it felt like to be wanted. Later, my husband touched my shoulder as he passed behind me in the kitchen, but I didn't feel the old spark. I wondered if he noticed my distraction, if he sensed the current pulsing just under the surface of my skin. He told me about a problem at work. I nodded and smiled, performing my part, but my thoughts were elsewhere, swirling like the rain outside. Lying, in bed, I traced the path of that kiss with my finger, letting the memory settle deep in my bones. I didn't know what would come next, but I knew, with an ache as sharp as joy, that I would never be the same. I drifted into sleep with the storm, still echoing in my chest, a wild, secret promise beating beneath my ribs. The following days pressed on with the stifling weight of late summer, that peculiar heaviness that seems to bend time and turn routine into something both numbing and restless. I moved through our apartment like an imposter, my body performing. Rituals, emptying the dishwasher, watering the ficus, answering calls for my freelance job, while my mind wandered elsewhere. I became acutely aware of the smallest details. The scent of dish soap, the feel of the morning air through the kitchen window, the way my husband's voice sounded when he read headlines over breakfast. Nothing was outwardly different, but everything inside me had shifted. The world felt split in two, one half visible and orderly, the other shadowed, vibrating with want. On Sunday, as I stood at the window watching the city turn gold under the late sun, my phone buzzed with a new message. Not from my friend, not from my husband, but from him. Just a few words, careful, cloaked in banality, but pulsing with secret meaning. "Do you remember the Rioja?" Beneath the ordinary question was a challenge, an invitation. I responded, cautiously, but my heart thudded in anticipation. The next message came just minutes later. He had tickets to an art exhibit downtown, something my friend didn't care for, and asked if I'd be interested. He made it sound innocent, the sort of thing old friends might do. But we both knew it wasn't innocent at all. I told my husband. I had errands to run, leaving him at his computer with a mug of coffee. On my way out, I caught my reflection in the hall mirror and hesitated, running my fingers over my hair. I chose a dress I hadn't worn in months, soft cotton just suggestive enough, and a set of new lingerie that still felt strange on my skin. It wasn't for him, or for anyone else. It was for the thrill, for the electric possibility of being seen. The city was alive that afternoon, full of noise and promise. We met on a side street near the museum, a calculated risk. He waited by a low stone wall, hands in his pockets, eyes tracking every movement in the crowd. When he saw me, he smiled, not with his mouth but with his whole posture, as if I was the only person who mattered. There was no embrace, no touch, just a brush of his arm against mine as we walked inside, a silent contract in the space between us. The exhibit was a blur, vibrant canvases, stark lines, the hush of strangers passing by. We drifted from painting to painting, talking in half sentences about color and light, never quite discussing what mattered. The words between us formed a second current, winding through the art. Sometimes he leaned in, voice low and conspiratorial, and I felt my body answer before my mind could intervene. "Do you ever think about just leaving?" he murmured as we stood before a riot of blues and reds. I tried to keep my tone steady. "Where would I go?" He shrugged, and his hand, for just a moment, pressed against the small of my back. A gesture so casual it could have been nothing, but I felt it everywhere. There was longing, there was danger, and I realized, not for the first time, that I wanted both. After the exhibit, we stepped out into the pale heat of the evening. The city pulsed around us. Car horns, music from an open cafe, the metallic tang of possibility. We hesitated on the sidewalk, neither ready to say goodbye. He mentioned an errand, a bottle of wine he'd forgotten to buy for his wife. I offered a ride, my voice too eager, but he just smiled and nodded. We walked to my car, our movements choreographed by caution and longing. Inside, the silence returned, thick with anticipation. My hand trembled slightly as I turned the key in the ignition. And he noticed. Of course he did. "Are you sure about this?" he asked quietly, not touching me, but his gaze never left my face. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The streets blurred as we drove, words falling away, replaced by the hum of what might happen next. When I parked near a small wine shop, he leaned in, his voice almost a whisper. "I can get it alone," he said, but I shook my head. "No, I want to come with you." It wasn't about the wine. It was about prolonging this suspended moment, stretching it until it almost snapped. Inside the shop, we wandered through the narrow aisles, the air cool and smelling faintly of cork and dust. Our hands brushed as we reached for the same bottle. I felt his breath near my ear as he whispered a joke about our mutual terrible taste. For an instant, the rest of the world faded, and we were only two people, hungry, reckless, teetering, at the edge. Back in the car, we sat with the bottle between us, not speaking. The sun was dipping low, gilding the city in amber. He turned toward me, his expression open, vulnerable. For a moment, I saw not the husband of my friend, but a man, searching for something lost just as I was. "I can't stop thinking about you," he said softly. I looked away, swallowing the ache in my chest. Me neither. Neither of us moved. The moment passed, as moments do, leaving behind a residue of longing, of fear, of possibility. When I finally dropped him off, we lingered, letting the silence stretch. I drove home with the taste of him on my skin, the press of his hand still echoing along my back. That night, I sat at the kitchen table long after everyone had gone to bed, fingers tracing invisible lines on the wood, imagining the next message, the next risk, the next impossible choice. I knew I was building a world that couldn't last, but for now it felt like the only world that mattered. In the distance, the city hummed, alive, indifferent, and utterly indifferent to secrets, to longing, to women like me who learned too. Late, that hunger doesn't fade with age, it only grows sharper, more cunning. And I wondered, for the first time, what I was truly willing to lose. Sleep came in jagged bursts after that night. I found myself drifting through shallow dreams, all vivid colors and unfinished sentences, waking in the dark with my heart pounding for reasons I pretended not to understand. In the mornings, the apartment was quiet except for the ticking of the old wall clock and the distant hum of city traffic. I kept up my routines with the meticulousness of someone afraid to stop, because stillness felt like surrender to everything I was beginning to want. Yet every day was charged with anticipation, as if something enormous and invisible hovered at the edge of my vision. Messages arrived from him at odd hours, never overt, always coded, but unmistakable in their intimacy. Sometimes a photograph of a street corner, or a quote from a book we'd discussed. Sometimes a simple, "thinking of you," the words hanging in the digital air until I breathed them in, a secret shared only between us. The distance between our real lives and the space we'd made for each other kept shrinking, cell by cell, until the barrier seemed nearly transparent. My friend called on a Thursday evening, her voice bright as always, asking if I could help set up for the weekend at their summer house just outside the city. It was their tradition, a small gathering of friends, grilled fish and laughter on the terrace, long evenings under the tangled vines. I hesitated for a moment, but the pull of that other world was stronger than my hesitation. I agreed, already, feeling the familiar electricity start to build. On the drive out, I paid too much attention to every detail. The way my husband loaded the car with blankets and pillows, how he asked about my week, his tone casual, oblivious to the private storm that raged inside me. I wore a simple white blouse and a skirt, nothing out of the ordinary, but beneath, the fabric, I'd chosen lingerie that was delicate, lacy, a shade of pale blue I'd never worn before. It was as if preparing for battle, a silent rebellion no one else would notice. We arrived just as the sun was setting, the house glowing with warm light, friends already gathered on the deck with glasses of wine. There was an ease to these evenings, a rhythm built over years of shared stories, but I felt myself watching from a distance, as if peering through glass. He was there, of course, helping his wife arrange platters of food, moving with the self-assurance that comes from being comfortable in one's own skin. Our eyes met just once across the crowded kitchen, and in that instant, everything else receded. It was not love. It was hunger, raw, immediate, impossible to dismiss. That night, when the guests had settled into small groups around the table, I slipped away to the kitchen under the pretense of checking the desserts. I needed a moment alone, a breath in the chaos. I stood at the window, staring out at the darkened garden, the air thick with the smell of rosemary and wood smoke. Footsteps behind me, quiet, deliberate. He stood in the doorway, saying nothing at first, just watching. Our conversation started in whispers, the language of accomplices. We spoke about mundane things, who was coming to the party, whether it might rain the next day, but beneath the surface was a restless, pulsing code. Every word was a question, every pause an answer. I asked if he liked the city this time of year, and he smiled, saying he preferred it when it was quiet, when you could walk for hours and never see the same face twice. I asked if he ever regretted anything, and he paused, his eyes holding mine. A little too long? He stepped closer, so close I could feel the heat rising from his skin, and I was aware, painfully, exhilaratingly, of how little separated us. I reached for the spoon on the counter just to have something to do with my hands, but he took it from me, setting it aside. There was no accidental touch this time, no pretense of necessity. He leaned in, his lips nearly brushing my ear, his breath soft. I felt the words more than I heard them. "We're playing with fire." I answered him in a whisper, not quite trusting my voice. Maybe that's the point. The sound of laughter from the terrace cut through the moment. We broke apart instantly, faces composed by the time his wife walked in, asking if we needed anything. He shook his head, all casual ease, and I smiled, trying to still my racing heart. I watched her put her arm around his waist, lean into him with the affection I'd admired for years. There was no jealousy in me, only a strange, hollow ache. I wondered how many secrets could fit between two people before something split wide open. Later, as we gathered on the deck beneath the fairy lights, he sat across from me, telling stories, making everyone laugh. I sipped my wine, legs curled beneath me, half listening, half drunk on the knowledge of what was unsaid. The night air was warm, heavy with the scent of jasmine and possibility. My husband's hand rested lightly on my knee, a gesture I barely registered. I wondered if he could feel the tremor in my body, the small, seismic shift in the way I carried myself. When the others finally retreated to their rooms, I lingered, alone on the deck, watching the embers glow in the grill. My skin was alive, every nerve singing. The house was full of sleeping people, yet I'd never felt more awake, more alert to the thrum of my own desire. I thought about the blue lace beneath my blouse, the memory of breath against my ear, the thrill of a secret, carried through the night. I understood with a clarity that was almost painful that there was no going back. Not now, not ever. The garden was silent, but inside me, everything had started to bloom, wild and uncontained, roots breaking through the careful order I had spent years maintaining. I stayed outside until the last embers died, afraid to let the night end, afraid of what the morning might bring, but certain at last that I was no longer lost. I was something else entirely, something reckless and awake. The morning after the gathering began, with sunlight streaming through the thin curtains, the air tinged with the scent of coffee and grilled bread. The house was already alive with small noises, footsteps in the hall, distant laughter, the clink of glasses. I moved through the kitchen with a sense of unreality, acutely aware of my own body and the blue lace that still pressed against my skin beneath a soft sweater. My husband was cheerful, humming as he brewed coffee, dropping a kiss on my head in passing. I let him, holding myself still, unsure of which part of my life was real. The day unfolded in fragments. We prepared food for the afternoon, sorted blankets for a picnic by the riverbank. There was a sense of casual chaos, everyone talking at once, music playing from someone's phone, my friend chasing her husband with a wooden spoon as he stole a piece of cheese. I watched them, that old familiar twinge of envy shifting to something more raw. Their affection was so public, so easy, and yet I'd seen the weariness in her eyes when she thought no one was looking. I wondered how much of any marriage was performance, how much was hope and habit sewn together until the seams became invisible. When we finally set out for the river, it was just the two couples. We walked in pairs at first, my friend and I a few steps ahead, our husbands carrying the basket and drinks behind us. My friend talked about plans for the summer, her voice bright and full of expectation, but I found myself drifting, watching shadows flicker over the path, listening for footsteps. The picnic unfolded in lazy sunlit hours, eating, napping on blankets, stories retold for the 100th time. It was the kind of day that felt endless, as if real life had been left behind. At some point, the men wandered off together, trailing a soccer ball, and my friend lay back with her hat over her face, murmuring that she might nap. I sat there in the dappled shade, my heart beating a restless rhythm. After a while, I rose and walked slowly toward the edge of the trees, the air cooler beneath the leaves. I wasn't looking for him, not exactly. I was escaping, seeking quiet, space to breathe. He was there, as if conjured by my own longing, leaning against a birch with the river behind him. He smiled, small and crooked, as if he'd expected me all along. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I felt the distance shrink, pulled taut between us, all the unsaid things coiling in the silence. He spoke first, voice pitched low. "You looked lonely over there," I answered honestly. "I don't think I know what I look like anymore." He stepped closer, every movement slow and deliberate. "I do." Something in me twisted at that, a mixture of fear and hope. He touched my wrist lightly, tracing the line of a vein with his thumb. The world around us faded to birdsong and wind. I felt my body respond, an ache, a pull, heat blooming under my skin. I let my head fall back against the tree, eyes closing, breath coming quicker. His hand cupped my cheek, thumb brushing a line along my jaw. There was no hurry, no pretense, just the gravity of two people drawn into the same orbit, unable or unwilling to resist. His lips met mine, soft at first, then deepening, the kiss slow and sure, careful as if he wanted to remember every detail. There was nothing rushed or furtive, only that wild, slow-burning certainty that something vital was happening. I tasted sunlight and green leaves, and his knee pressed against mine. I thought of the blue lace beneath my sweater and felt both exposed and safe at once. He whispered against my lips, "I want this." I felt the tremor in his voice, the echo of my own longing. I pressed my forehead to his, eyes still closed. "Me too." We lingered like that, sharing breath, letting our hands map the edges of possibility, neither of us willing to let go. For a few stolen moments, the world was small, reduced to touch and scent, and the quiet promise of more. When we finally returned to the picnic, I saw my husband waving, calling us over with a lazy smile, oblivious. My friend was still napping, one hand resting on her book. The ordinariness of it all was dizzying, like stepping from a dream into the bright light of day. I felt changed, electric, every nerve awake. The secret between us was no longer just a possibility. It was a living thing, woven through every gesture, every look. The drive back to the house was filled with the kind of polite chatter that only deepens the divide between what is said and what is meant. I sat beside my husband, legs tucked neatly beneath me, and answered his questions about the picnic, forcing myself to sound normal. But inside, I was somewhere else entirely, a place of trembling anticipation and new urgent hunger. That night, I took extra care as I undressed for bed, folding my clothes neatly, slipping between cool sheets with the memory of his kiss lingering on my lips. My husband reached for me in the dark, and I let him, but the sensations felt far away, dulled by comparison. I watched the shadows play across the ceiling and listened to the sound of his breathing as he fell asleep beside me. The house was quiet, but inside me the story roared on. I lay awake, touching my lips, wondering how long we could keep our secret alive, how much longer the walls could hold back the rising tide. I knew there would be consequences, pain, discovery, the shattering of something I'd spent years building. But I also knew, with the sharp clarity of desire, that I would not turn back. I was already lost, and I didn't want to be found. The days after our return unfolded with a kind of feverish monotony, every ordinary gesture made strange by the secret I carried beneath my skin. The world outside moved as it always had. Neighbors tending window boxes, delivery trucks rumbling over cobblestone, my husband's familiar footsteps echoing through our apartment in the early mornings. Yet nothing felt familiar. I saw myself, from a distance, an actress reciting lines in a play whose plot had twisted beyond her control. Routine became both refuge and torment. I cooked, I folded laundry, I answered emails, each task an anchor I clung to even as my thoughts strayed. At dinner, my husband would tell me about an annoying client, or ask my opinion on weekend plans. His tone was gentle, sometimes even affectionate, but I heard in it an echo of distance, a subtle, widening gulf that neither of us acknowledged aloud. Occasionally, he would reach for my hand under the table, fingers squeezing in a gesture of reassurance, and I would squeeze back, letting the warmth linger in my palm even as my mind drifted elsewhere. I tried to convince myself that nothing had truly changed, that I could still be the woman I had always been, if only I worked harder at it. I arranged fresh flowers in the hallway, replaced the worn-out bath mat, surprised my husband with his favorite dessert one evening. He noticed, seemed grateful, even flirted with me in that shy, understated way that had first drawn me to him, years ago. We made love late that night, a tender, careful ritual. I closed my eyes and let him touch me, willing my body to respond. But my thoughts strayed. Blue lace, rough hands on my cheek, the memory of a kiss stolen in the dappled light of a riverbank. I bit my lip, swallowed the ache of guilt, and pretended to sleep afterward, holding myself motionless until dawn. He met me at the station, his smile soft and reassuring, his touch light on my elbow as he guided me toward the train. The journey itself felt dreamlike, the landscape unfurling outside the window in blurs of green and gold. We spoke in hushed tones, our conversation dancing between the trivial and the intimate, the way the salt air stung our lungs, stories from our separate pasts, the quiet admission of how much we had both needed this escape. I watched the way he looked at me, not as someone who belonged to another, but as someone entirely his own. The coastal town greeted us with the cry of gulls and the scent of brine. We walked along the waterfront, shoes in hand, letting the waves lick at our ankles. The simplicity of the moment, sand between my toes, sunlight tangled in my hair, his laughter ringing out into the wind, made everything else seem unreal. For a few precious hours, the world narrowed to the press of his hand in mine, the silent promises exchanged in each glance. Yet even as I let myself be swept away, I felt the undertow of reality pulling at my ankles. In the privacy of a small seaside inn, we sat together on a narrow balcony, sharing a bottle of wine as dusk folded over the rooftops. The conversation turned inevitably to what we were risking, what we were building with each secret. "Are you happy?" he asked, his voice low. I stared at my hands, searching for the truth in their tremor. "I don't know," I admitted. "I want to be. I want something more, something I can't even name." He reached for me, his fingers interlacing with mine. The gesture was tender, not urgent, an offering of presence rather than escape. We sat in silence for a long while, letting the quiet bind us together more tightly than words ever could. I realized with a kind of aching clarity that I was not looking for permission or absolution. What I craved was the chance to be fully awake, fully alive, even if only for the space of a single, borrowed day. That night, as I lay beside him in the unfamiliar bed, I listened to the rhythm of his breathing and tried to memorize every detail. The weight of his arm around my waist, the hush of the sea beyond the open window, the sense that the future was both limitless and impossibly fragile. I knew even then that nothing would last forever. But for now, I let myself drift, caught between regret and hope, suspended in the golden hush of a life I might never truly claim. Every return is a negotiation with reality. As the train slid back toward the city, landscapes rushing by in soft streaks of color, I felt myself being slowly stitched back into the life I had temporarily abandoned. The weight of keys in my bag, the distant hum of phone notifications, the familiar ache of responsibility. all of it pressed closer, as each mile brought me nearer to home. He sat beside me close enough that I could feel the heat of his thigh, his hand brushing mine from time to time as if confirming that I was still there, that what we'd shared was not a fever dream. There was an unspoken agreement in our silence, to let the hours linger, to breathe in the remains of salt air and the fragile euphoria that had marked our brief escape. We shared small observations, glances out the window, an occasional squeeze of the hand, gestures that spoke louder than any confession. Yet as the city skyline grew, jagged and gray, so did the sense of something tightening in my chest. The closer we came to the world we both inhabited, the more impossible it felt to pretend nothing had changed. My phone vibrated with a string of messages, one from my husband, checking when I'd be home, another from my closest friend, her words. Casual but edged with curiosity. She wanted to meet for coffee, said she had something funny to tell me, but the tone of her message sent a ripple of unease through me. I typed a non-committal reply, the device heavy in my hand, and glanced at my companion. His expression was unreadable, a mixture of longing and caution. When the train pulled in, the station was a blur of movement and noise. We hesitated by the platform, the final moments stretching taut between us. He reached for my hand, fingers lingering on my wrist. "We can't keep this up forever," he murmured, voice low. "Sooner or later, someone will notice." I met his gaze, searching for reassurance, but found only a mirror of my own anxiety. "I know, I can't let go yet." My words were barely above a whisper, thick with wanting and fear. We parted with a swift, subtle embrace, one last press of his lips at my temple, a promise kept in silence. I made my way home in a daze, weaving through the familiar streets with a new sense of vulnerability. The city seemed sharper, every sound and color amplified by the knowledge of what I had done. Inside my apartment, the normal rhythms resumed, almost instantly. My husband greeted me with a relieved smile, his arms warm and solid as he drew me close. He asked about my day, and I offered up a version of the truth so polished it felt foreign. We ate together, talked about plans for the week, and he recounted a story from work, laughing in that gentle, rumbling way I had once adored. I watched him carefully, searching for any flicker of suspicion, any sign that he sensed the shift beneath the surface. But if he noticed, he said nothing. My husband, too, became more attentive, as if he could sense the tectonic shifts beneath our shared routines. He brought me flowers one night, sunflowers, my favorite, and I thanked him, trying to let gratitude bloom where desire had faded. We talked late into the evening, our words circling old memories, childhood stories, regrets never fully voiced. There was a gentle sadness to these conversations, a recognition of everything we'd lost in the years of doing what was expected of us. He squeezed my hand across the table, held my gaze a little longer than usual, but I saw the flicker of suspicion behind his affection, the moments when he studied my face as if searching for proof of something unspoken. I wanted to reach for him, to assure him that he wasn't wrong, that I was slipping away from him and didn't know how to stop. Instead, I clung to silence, let the secrets stack up like stones in my chest. The man I met in secret, the man who had become my addiction, seemed more desperate now, too. Our messages grew bolder, our meetings more reckless. We met in a deserted parking lot after dark, in the back corner of a crowded cinema, even in the dusty stacks of a library where no one looked for us. The risk became part of the attraction, as if danger could justify the wanting. Once, when I tried to end things, told him we had to stop before we destroyed everything, he shook his head, his voice strained. "We're already past the point of no return." The sadness in his eyes matched my own. I remember that meeting most of all, the one where we promised for the last time that it was over. We sat in his car, rain streaking the windshield, our hands entwined on the console between us. Neither of us spoke for a long time. There was nothing left to say, no words that could untangle the knot of longing and regret binding us together. I looked out at the water pooling on the pavement, thinking how easy it would be to open the door and run, to let the rain wash me clean. But I stayed. I always stayed. He pressed his lips to my hand, soft and lingering. I felt the shudder run through him and, unexpectedly, through me as well. "I love you," he said, voice breaking. I wanted to say it back, wanted to believe it would make everything right. But love was not enough. It never had been. Afterward, I drove home through empty streets, headlights shimmering in the puddles. The city felt vast and hollow. At home, my husband was waiting up, concern etched into every line of his face. He asked where I'd been, and I lied. Again, more smoothly now, as if I'd been doing it all my life. I went through the motions of a marriage, cooked dinner, folded shirts, smiled when he made a joke. But every gesture cost me something. Every word felt weighted, dangerous, as if the air itself might betray me. In the quiet that followed, I stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, searching for the woman I used to be. I barely recognized her. My skin looked thinner, my eyes older. The desire that once seemed thrilling now tinged with dread. I splashed water on my face, willing the guilt to dissolve, but it clung to me like a second skin. The next morning, I awoke to a message from him. A single line, "I miss you," sent before dawn. My hands shook as I typed my reply. I told myself, again, that this would be the last time that I could find my way back, if only I was strong enough. But each attempt to break away only pulled me deeper, bound by the promise of a passion that made ordinary life feel ghostly by comparison. It was then I realized I was no longer choosing, not really. I was being pulled by currents I had set in motion, unable to predict where they would carry me next. The story I was living had slipped beyond my control, each day bringing me closer to the moment when truth would erupt through the surface of our carefully constructed lives, leaving nothing untouched. I could only wait, counting the heartbeats, between disaster and desire, longing for rescue and terrified by the thought of being found. The world began to constrict around me, as if the walls of our apartment had started to inch closer every day. There were moments, bending to tie my shoes, washing my hands in the kitchen sink, standing at the grocery checkout, when I felt watched, even in solitude. My phone was a living thing, pulsing in my pocket with every message, and I started to dread the sound as much as I craved it. I checked and rechecked my notifications, deleting threads until my fingers ached, but still I feared I'd missed something, that a digital ghost would rise up and betray me. My husband's intuition had sharpened to a needlepoint. He hovered, at the edge of every room, lingering in doorways, following my movements with a careful, almost clinical attention. There was a subtle shift in our conversations. Every casual question landed with an extra weight. Every smile lingered a beat too long as he searched my face for cracks in the mask. Sometimes I caught him studying my phone when I left it unattended. Once I saw him scrolling through my photos, eyes narrowed as if a secret might be hidden in pixels. "Who were you texting?" he asked one evening, the words tossed lightly, but his posture tense. I lied without hesitation, told him it was my friend, the one with a new puppy and endless questions about training. He nodded, but I could see doubt flicker in his eyes, could feel the gravity of my own deceit tugging the air tight between us. My friend became more present, too, popping by unannounced or inviting me out for walks. On one of these afternoons, as we strolled through the park, she stopped mid-sentence and looked at me hard, her voice brittle. "You're different lately. Distant. Is everything okay?" I opened my mouth, but the truth stalled behind my teeth. I told her I was tired, that I hadn't been sleeping well, that work was overwhelming. She listened, unconvinced, then let the subject drop. We walked on in silence, the rhythm of our steps measured and cautious. The man who had become my secret world was growing restless as well. Our meetings grew hurried, snatched between obligations. We no longer lingered over glasses of wine or idle talk. Now the few minutes we stole together pulsed with urgency and unease. He sent fewer messages, but each was weighted with longing or with fear. Once, after a particularly tense rendezvous in the back room of a cafe, he grabbed my wrist, his voice trembling. "They know, don't they? It's only a matter of time." That night at home, my husband watched me over dinner, silent and severe. I felt as if every movement was under a microscope. The way I buttered my bread, the way I lifted my glass, the way my hand shook when I set down my fork. The space between us at the table was crowded with things unsaid. Afterward, I went to bed early, feigning a headache, and lay awake listening to the sounds of the apartment. His footsteps in the hall, the faint ping of a phone, the soft thud as he shut the door to his study. Sleep was fragmented, interrupted by anxious dreams and the fear of discovery. In the blue hour before dawn, I woke to the faint buzz of my phone. A message from him. "I can't keep this up. I'm sorry." My chest tightened. I stared at the words, feeling the world tilt beneath me. The next day was marked by a suffocating stillness. My friend called, her tone forced and bright, and I let her words wash over me, unable to respond. My husband left early, not meeting my eyes, his brief kiss colder than the November air outside. I cleaned the apartment in a frenzy, scrubbing every surface as if I could erase what I had done. By evening, exhaustion had hollowed me out, but relief never came. A few days later, I saw him one last time, on a gray street corner just after sunset. He looked older, thinner, a little broken around the edges. We didn't embrace. We stood facing each other, hands deep in our pockets, the city bustling past. "We can't keep pretending," he said, voice rough. I nodded, unable to speak, and for a moment it was as if we were strangers again, two people who had simply gotten lost. When I returned home, the lights were on in every room, my husband waiting at the kitchen table. He looked up, his eyes rimmed red, his mouth drawn tight. I opened my mouth, but he held up a hand, silencing me. There was no accusation, only exhaustion, the sense that the long-expected storm had finally arrived. I sat across from him in the stark kitchen light, the silence thick and final. That night, I lay awake, listening to his breathing, wondering what would happen next. My heart ached with a kind of grief I hadn't expected, not just for the loss of passion or the shattering of trust, but for all the ordinary days that could never be recaptured. The double life I'd built was dissolving, leaving only fragments, each sharper than the last. I realized at last that no amount of careful planning or desperate wishing could hold back the truth forever. It seeped through every crack, every pause, every unfinished sentence. I had chosen this path, one small step at a time, and now I was walking its length alone, uncertain what, if anything, waited at the end. Morning arrived heavy and gray. The sky hung low over the city as if it could not quite bring itself to brighten. I lay still for a long time, listening to the silence in our bedroom. My husband's side of the bed was empty, the warmth already gone. The apartment felt vast, echoing, every sound exaggerated, water in the pipes, the distant rattle of the elevator, a car horn several blocks away. I rose, pulling on the same robe I'd worn 100 mornings before, but its softness felt foreign against my skin. In the mirror, I saw shadows under my eyes, my hair tangled from restless sleep, the marks of worry pressing deeper than any age. I moved through the motions of breakfast, pouring coffee, buttering bread, careful not to make noise, as if quiet could protect me from what waited beyond the kitchen door. I wasn't sure if I hoped for confrontation or for mercy, only that something in our lives had cracked wide open and there would be no hiding from it now. The hours stretched, elastic and slow. My husband returned mid-morning, shoulders stooped, a grocery bag in hand. He set it down on the counter and paused, his back to me. When he finally turned, I saw the question in his eyes, the one he'd been carrying for weeks, maybe months. I braced myself for anger, accusation, a demand for truth. Instead, his voice was tired, raw at the edges. "How long?" he asked. The question hung in the air, heavy and impossible to escape. I tried to answer, but the words snagged in my throat, thick with regret and relief and all the exhaustion I'd buried inside me. I wanted to explain, to confess every moment, every hesitation, every longing and every mistake. But what was left to say when the damage had already been done? It wasn't just once, I managed finally, my voice barely above a whisper. And it wasn't only about him. It was about me, about everything I lost in the quiet years. He closed his eyes for a long moment. I watched his hands, so familiar, so changed now, clench and unclench at his sides. When he spoke again, it was not with anger, but with something sadder. "Do you want to stay?" I had no answer. The silence between us felt alive, something breathing and wounded. All I could do was shake my head, tears gathering and falling silently. He nodded as if he'd expected nothing less, and left the room without another word. The apartment was still. I walked from room to room, touching the backs of chairs, the edge of the bookshelf, the frame of our wedding photo. Every surface seemed charged with memory. Laughter, arguments, late-night confessions, 1,000 small kindnesses I had come to take for granted. I found myself sitting at the foot of the bed, hands in my lap, waiting for something. Guilt, maybe, or the sharp sting of freedom. But mostly I felt emptied out, hollowed by the weight of what had happened and what could never be undone. Later I wandered outside, letting the cold air bite at my cheeks. I moved through the city in a kind of trance, past the cafe where we'd first met, the market where he had once reached for my hand, the bridge where I had stood and wondered who I might become. Each place held its own ghost, a memory unspooling behind my eyes, vivid and painful and real. I did not seek him out. There was nothing left to say, no apology that could heal what we had broken. Instead, I walked until my legs ached, the city unfolding around me in shades of gray and gold. For the first time in years, I felt the possibility of choice, of a life not shaped entirely by longing or by duty. As evening fell, I returned home to the quiet, my phone silent for once, no messages blinking with need or expectation. I sat at the kitchen table, watching dusk slip across the floor. There was sorrow, and there was relief, and in the space between them, something like hope, a fragile, unsteady thing. I understood now that the story did not end in a single act of betrayal, or in its messy aftermath. It ended, if it ended at all, with the slow, hard work of forgiveness, of others, of myself, and with the uncertain, terrifying freedom of beginning again. In the silence of that room, I finally let myself grieve, not only for what I had lost, but for everything I had dared, and for whatever life might still remain beyond the ruin.